Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are strapping in for an accelerated high-yield journey through the anatomy of the shoulder girdle and the arm.
Yeah, and it's a region that, if you've ever tried to draw it or even just visualize it, you know it's a beautiful, complex puzzle.
It is. It's really defined by one critical, constant conflict, right? You
Yep.
have this astonishing mobility.
Mm.
But it's always being compromised by the ruthless demand for stability.
Hmm.
That conflict is the core theme of this whole area.
Right.
The upper limb, and especially the shoulder, isn't just a simple hinge. It's incredibly differentiated to do these complex movements. Everything from really precise stereotactic stuff,
Like fine motor skills.
exactly,
Mm.
to big non-stereotactic movements like swinging a bat and even, subtle gestures. And all of that sophistication is really there for one reason, to let the hand do its job.
So our mission today is to give you that shortcut to understanding this architecture. We're going to unpack the bony scaffolding, the joints, the muscles, and the crucial neurovascular pathways. And as we go, you should keep that central paradox in mind. Stability actually increases and becomes more efficient the further down the arm you go.
Okay, so more stable towards the hand.
Exactly. Down at the wrist and hand, you get what we call close packing. That's a state of maximum stability with the least amount of energy.
Okay.
But compare that to the shoulder, the glenohumeral joint.
Right.
That joint relies almost entirely on dynamic muscular activity for its stability. It's incredibly energy costly, which is why fatigue and age-related issues are such a big clinical problem there over time.
So let's start at that foundational level, not just the bone, but the tissue that wraps everything together.
Yeah.
The deep fascia. This isn't just passive saran wrap for the muscles, is it?
Not at all. The deep fascia has a profound functional role. It basically makes muscles more efficient by extending their attachment area, their footprint, you could say.
How does that work?
Well, think of the scapula. The fascia covering the subscapularis, infraspinatus, and supraspinatus muscles is anchored firmly to the bone medially. It forms this dense, rigid structure we call a fibro-osseous cuff.
So the muscle gets a mechanical advantage because the fascia gives it a broader, stronger origin point than just the bare bone.
Precisely. It enhances their leverage. And while we're talking about fascia, we should, mention its clinical role with things like compartment syndrome.
Which is less common in the arm than, say, the forearm or leg, but it's still a huge risk after those high-energy crush injuries.
Yes. And fascia also dictates how infection spreads, which is a key thing to visualize. If you have a deep axillary separation, an infection deep to the clavipectoral fascia, it has a clear path.
Where does it go?
It'll track upwards, right up the neurovascular sheath, and it often presents at the root of the neck. A superficial infection, on the other hand, is easier to predict. It usually just surfaces at the axillary folds.
Okay, let's shift to the scaffolding itself, the clavicle, the collarbone. It's the single bony connection, linking the entire arm to the central skeleton.
And it has this unique record, right?
It does. It's the very first bone in the body to start ossifying, and it uses this weird mix of both intramembranous and endochondral methods.
That combination is fascinating, and its shape is just so critical. If you picture the clavicle, the medial 3/5, the part near your sternum, is thick and almost cylindrical.
Right.
But as you move out toward the shoulder, it flattens out dramatically into that lateral 2/5.
And that transition point where the shape changes so suddenly.
That's the weak link. It's the typical fracture site because that's where all the mechanical forces concentrate. And clinically, if that fracture heals badly, if it's displaced, the consequences are huge.
Because of gravity.
Because of gravity. The weight of the arm just pulls that lateral fragment down and forward, and that shift can distort the retroclavicular space.
Which is that tight area right behind the collarbone where everything important passes through.
Exactly. Your brachial plexus, your subclavian vessels. If that space gets compromised, you can end up with symptoms of thoracic outlet obstruction. It's a perfect example of structure dictating clinical function.
All right, let's move posteriorly to the scapula, that big triangular bone over the back of the ribs.
Yeah, usually covering ribs 2 through 7, and it's surprisingly robust for how thin it looks because its structure is strategically reinforced.
How so?
It's built around 3 strong, bony columns that all converge at the neck, right near the shoulder joint. You have the lateral border of the spine, the strong coracoid process, and the lateral border of the bone itself. They're all about transmitting load.
And when we're visualizing the scapula, we have to contrast its two faces, right? The front and the back.
Absolutely. The costal surface, the one facing the ribs, is gently concave. It's dominated by the huge subscapular fossa, which is the attachment for the subscapularis muscle.
Okay.
Now, if you turn it around, the dorsal surface is completely different. It's divided by that big shelf-like spine into the smaller supraspinous fossa above and the much larger infraspinous fossa below.
So with the bony anchors set, let's look at the mechanical links. Starting medially, we've got the sternoclavicular joint, the SC joint.
Right. It's a synovial sellar joint shaped like a saddle, and it's the only skeletal link between the entire upper limb and the trunk.
So stability here must be critical.
It is, and it's almost all down to soft tissue, not the bony fit. You have the intrinsic ligaments, but the real star of the show is the massive extrinsic costoclavicular ligament.
Why is that one so important?
It's just structured so cleverly. Think of it like a short inverted cone connecting the clavicle down to the first rib. It has two distinct layers, or laminae, with fibers that cross each other.
I see.
That crossing pattern lets it resist forces in multiple directions, so it stops the medial clavicle from popping up or rotating too much. It's way stronger than the capsule ligaments alone.
And when is that joint at its most stable, its most close packed?
During maximum posterior rotation, and that's the movement you do when you fully raise your arm over your head, that rotation tensions the ligaments and checks the motion. And we think the subclavius muscle plays a role here too.
As a decelerator.
Exactly. It probably helps to break that motion and protect the ligaments from getting stretched out over time.
Okay, let's pivot and travel laterally along the clavicle to the acromioclavicular joint, the AC joint.
Another synovial joint, but this one's a plain joint. And again, the primary stability doesn't come from its own capsule. It comes from an accessory structure, the coracoclavicular ligament.
That's the one that's absolutely essential for stopping shoulder separation.
It is. And it has two parts you have to visualize. You've got the conoid and the trapezoid.
Lay those out for us.
The conoid is posteromedial. It's dense and almost vertical. The trapezoid is anterolateral and broader. Together, the conoid resists vertical shear, and the trapezoid resists horizontal and rotational forces. You need both to keep the scapula and clavicle properly aligned.
Which brings us to the scapulothoracic articulation. Now, this isn't a true joint, is it?
No, not in the anatomical sense. It's more of a functional concept.
Yeah.
It's the movement involving the SC and AC joints, plus that gliding space between the scapula and the chest wall.
So it has zero intrinsic stability.
Zero. It is purely muscular. Its only job is to position the glenohumeral joint in space to maximize the arm's reach and function.
So we rely completely on those strap muscles around it. Can you give us a quick rundown of the main movers?
Sure. For elevation like shrugging, you're thinking trapezius and levator scapulae.
Okay, and for protraction, like reaching forward?
The heavy lifters there are serratus anterior and pectoralis minor. And for retraction, pulling the shoulders back, it's the trapezius again and the rhomboids. Every little movement of the arm starts with this perfectly coordinated ballet of scapular muscles.
This brings us to the main event, the glenohumeral joint, the GH joint. Most mobile in the body, which, as we said, makes it the most frequently dislocated.
Yeah, the ultimate mobility-stability compromise. I mean, the articulation itself tells the story. The humeral head is this big sphere, and it's about 4 times larger than the shallow little glenoid fossa it sits in.
So how does the body keep that big ball centered on that tiny socket against gravity and massive leverage forces?
The number one mechanism is something called concavity compression.
Concavity compression.
The rotator cuff muscles fire to centrally compress the humeral head into the fossa. They're literally squeezing it in place like a marble in a wet bowl. It's a dynamic process.
And we also have the glenoid labrum.
Right, that fibrocartilaginous rim around the fossa. It helps deepen the socket, increasing the surface area by about 50%. And its superior attachment is incredibly important.
Why is that?
Because it blends directly with the origin of the long head of the biceps tendon. This creates a really strong superior anchor point, but also a potential site for pathology, especially with overhead athletes.
Okay, let's touch on the key internal ligaments. We hear about the 3 glenohumeral ligaments.
We do. Superior, middle, and inferior. But the inferior glenohumeral ligament complex is the real heavy hitter when the arm is up. It's often described as a hammock-like structure.
A hammock.
Yeah, it cradles the humeral head and provides vital stability when the arm is in that vulnerable, abducted, and externally rotated position.
And we can't forget the biceps tendon itself running through the joint.
Right. It traverses the joint in its own synovial sheath, and it's held in its groove by the transverse humeral ligament, which acts like a little strap to stop it from popping out.
Speaking of smooth motion, what about the bursae? The little fluid-filled sacs.
They're critical gliding planes. The subcoracoid, subacromial, and subdeltoid bursae are often basically continuous, forming this massive external gliding surface. And clinically, that's why inflammation or fibrosis scarring in this area is so devastating.
Because if you restrict that glide...
You restrict the shoulder. Simple as that.
Now for the rotator cuff. Subscapularis, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor, their action is defined by the deltoid couple. What exactly is that synergy?
It's the essential partnership for elevation. The deltoid is a powerful muscle that pulls the arm upward, but if it acted alone, it would just translate the humeral head upward and slam it into the acromion.
That's impingement.
Classic impingement. The rotator cuff muscles act together to counteract that upward pull. They provide a centralized, compressive, and slightly downward force that keeps the head seated and rotating perfectly in the socket as you lift your arm.
And here's a little nugget from the source I love. We're taught 4 rotator cuff muscles, but functionally, we should probably consider a 5th.
Teres major. That's right. Despite how it's usually classified, teres major acts as a critical part of this centralizing system. It supports the inferior capsule and helps buttress the humeral head, especially when the arm is elevated above 90 degrees.
So it's like a functional partner to the subscapularis.
It is. It even shares innervation from the posterior cord. If you only think about the classic 4, you're missing a major stabilizer sitting right below the joint.
All right, moving down the arm, the muscles are neatly divided into compartments. The anterior compartment has the flexors.
The key players there are biceps brachii, which is a really powerful supinator of the forearm as well as a flexor, and the brachialis.
And the brachialis is the prime elbow flexor.
It is. It's the workhorse, always active no matter how your forearm is rotated. And it has this fantastic anatomical feature that shows just how much redundancy is in the system.
The dual innervation.
Exactly. It gets motor input from both the musculocutaneous nerve and the radial nerve. It's brilliant. If the musculocutaneous nerve gets damaged, the radial nerve can still signal the brachialis to contract, so you maintain some elbow flexion.
And in the posterior compartment, we have the extensors, which is all about the triceps brachii.
The 3 heads of the triceps are the major extensors, and an important detail here is how they activate. The medial head is active in all forms of elbow extension, providing that sort of constant background force.
Okay.
The lateral and long heads, though, they really only kick in strongly when you're extending against significant resistance.
Now let's trace the crucial neurovascular supply, starting with the axillary artery.
The pectoralis minor muscle is the key landmark you need to visualize here. It crosses right over the artery and divides it into 3 parts. We're most interested in that third part, distal to the muscle.
Because that's where the major supply lines to the shoulder come from.
That's right. You get the big subscapular artery, which immediately splits into the circumflex scapular and thoracodorsal, and then you have the anterior and posterior circumflex humeral arteries.
And these vessels define those key spaces in the back of the shoulder, formed by the triceps and teres muscles.
Yes, the triangular and quadrangular spaces, and we need to map them out because of their clinical importance. So first, picture the quadrangular space.
Okay, what are the borders?
It's bounded superiorly by teres minor, inferiorly by teres major, medially by the long head of triceps, and laterally by the surgical neck of the humerus.
And that's a critical bottleneck.
A huge one. It transmits the axillary nerve and the posterior circumflex humeral artery and vein. So if you fracture the surgical neck of the humerus...
That neurovascular bundle is immediately at risk.
Immediately. Then you have the triangular spaces. The upper triangular space has the circumflex scapular vessels, and the lower triangular space, or triangular interval, is where the radial nerve and the profunda brachii vessels pass as they spiral down the arm.
Knowing those spaces lets us predict what's wrong when we see nerve palsies. What are the key presentations here?
Well, the one we just mentioned, axillary nerve palsy. From a surgical neck fracture or a shoulder dislocation, you'll see abnormal sensation over the deltoid and, of course, weakness or paralysis of the deltoid and teres minor. The patient just can't initiate abduction.
And then you have those dramatic deficits from the scapular stabilizers.
Oh, yeah. Think about long thoracic nerve palsy, which supplies the serratus anterior. When that nerve is out, the muscle fails to hold the scapula against the chest wall.
And you get the classic winging of the scapula.
Exactly. The entire medial border just stands out prominently from the back, pulled up and in by the unopposed trapezius and rhomboids.
And we should contrast that winging with what you see in an accessory nerve palsy, which hits the trapezius.
It's a completely different posture. The trapezius is the primary suspensory muscle of the shoulder girdle. So when the accessory nerve goes, the scapula doesn't wing out, it just drops straight down and away from the spine. It's a profound disruption of the whole shoulder's suspension.
We've covered a tremendous amount of ground here, really cementing the structure and function of the shoulder, girdle, and arm.
We have,
And we started with that foundational paradox.
Yeah.
You need this high-energy, purely muscular stability up at the shoulder joint.
to allow for the complex, low-energy mechanical stability you get distally in the hand. It's an amazing system.
We mapped everything from the unique ossification of the clavicle to the dynamic forces in the joints and traced those critical neurovascular bundles through some very tight spaces.
And, to tie it all together, there's a concept the sources highlight called angiomyotomes.
Angiomyotomes.
It's the observation that nerve supply and blood supply often co-locate. What's fascinating here is that the innervation and the arterial supply for functional muscle groups, like the dorsal scapular muscles and the rotator cuff, they correspond extremely closely.
Which raises a really critical question about how we interpret pain, doesn't it?
It does, exactly. When a patient's pain is diffuse, burning, fatigue-related, what we often call ischemic pain from lack of blood flow, is it sometimes more helpful to map the source by tracing the vascular supply route instead of just relying on the neural dermatome?
So think about the plumbing just as much as the wiring.
Precisely. Especially in areas like the supraspinous tendon, which sits in a tight space and is known to have areas of poor blood flow, making it really prone to that ischemic fatigue and pain.
That's a truly provocative thought to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the structure and function of the shoulder, girdle, and arm. From the whole Last Minute Lecture team, thanks for listening.